Good afternoon, dear viewers. On the last show I hosted, we discussed the role religion and spirituality plays in our lives. Today, we'll be looking at a topic that some would say requires a great deal of faith to understand. In Hinduism, it is said we're living in the era of the Kali Yuga, where righteousness is on the decline and man is at his lowest. Today, we'll discuss an example of where man was at his lowest, the conclusion of the war in Sri Lanka. This past week proved to be an emotional week for our community with the UK Channel 4 release of their second documentary, Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, War Crimes Unpunished. This upcoming week will prove to be a very significant week for our community. The United Nations Human Rights Council is currently in session. One of the major decisions facing the Council is a resolution put forth by the United States of America, calling on Sri Lanka to independently investigate the wartime abuses conducted by both sides during the conclusion of the war. Today on the show, we will have the opportunity to talk to two very knowledgeable individuals, Kubes Navaratnam and Gary Anandasangari, who will provide us with great insight on our topic matter. First, we will talk to Kubes Navaratnam. Kubes is a lawyer by profession, working mainly in the area of appellate review and land development. He completed his LLM in 2010 at the University of Toronto on the topic of the need for post-conflict investigatory mechanisms in the responsibility to protect doctrine. Welcome, Kubes.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on our show. So, as I mentioned in our introduction, this past week saw the release of Channel 4's second documentary on Sri Lanka, particularly with a particular focus on the war crimes that are considered to be unpunished. Can you provide us with an explanation about the video and its purpose?
Well, the Channel 4 documentary lays out evidence that it claims to say that in the last phases of the Sri Lankan war, several war crimes or possible crimes against humanity was committed. Now, as many people might know, there was a previous documentary which it brought out about a year ago that's also laid out some allegations. In this documentary, what it purports to do is set out 4 case studies that looks at specific war crimes. Now, in the settings of war crimes or crimes against humanity, like any other crime that you need to prove, it has to be specific crimes, the actions as well as the mental state the government was in when it committed it. So what it purports to do is, instead of alleging these crimes independently or in a vacuum, it sets out 4 case studies, brings in evidence through video footage, through documents, through eyewitness accounts, and it tries to set forth 4 cases that it has good, credible evidence in its view. Now, mind you, whatever the evidence brought before Channel 4 might not be, in the end of the day, allowed in a court of law.
Okay.
But right now, it's producing as much evidence as it can to put on the world record that there is possible war crimes or crimes against humanity committed in the final phases of war.
Okay, so with Channel 4's involvement in this post-conflict situation, it raises the question of the international community's role. Can you speak on the importance of actors such as the United Nations, Channel 4, which is a media organization, and other countries in finding some resolution or perhaps an answer to a lot of the concerns people have with Sri Lanka?
See, that's a very good point you raised, because international humanitarian law was created and it came out of international conflicts. So the laws adhered to by nations when conducting wars with each other. And that's sort of how it started off in the battlefield, where people had customary norms that they practiced when they were fighting each other. And that eventually, in the early 1900s, became documented in the Hague Conventions, as these are sort of the set of rules that we must follow as international actors when we conduct war. Now, past World War II, most of the armed conflicts and most of the devastation that occurs with armed conflicts are internal in nature. So they are within a border of one state. And therefore, the law that developed in the early part of the 19th century focused on international actors, and there were many mechanisms when two countries fight each other and there was abuses, there would be somebody there to document the abuse, somebody with equal power there to document the abuse. Now, if with an armed conflict that is internal in nature, conducted by or with the support of a state, now the information that's brought out is restricted and in the hands of the state itself. So in this crucial in these kind of settings, it's crucial for external players, whether that be NGOs or UN bodies or media, to help bring forth this evidence or any possible evidence when the state is trying to restrict or maybe not bring out the evidence of war crimes or possible war crimes.
So which countries have you observed have been leading this international effort to play a role in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka, I mean, it is usually the Western powers that are leading this. So, in different varying strengths, the US, Canada, Australia, the Commonwealth countries, Europe, have been leading the charge of human rights allegations and any accountability to those allegations. Now, there is that counter argument that, hey, the US has its own hands dirty and its own hands bloody, and how dare they be hypocritical when they're looking at another state? And there's some valid argument that when states infringe on a sovereign nation, they could be doing it for political reasons. Let's be frank and say many states do act when their interests are concerned. But that alone is not an argument to not look into the allegations. That could be an argument against the underlying reasons for these Western nations to do. But given that there is ample evidence coming out of a country which pretty much restricted a lot of coverage and a lot of media, a lot of information coming out, and there's still some information coming out, then I think these allegations stand to start the investigation. We're not at a point where we can say this definitely is tantamount to war crimes or crimes against humanity, but the fact that there is these evidence is enough it should be enough for a country, especially Sri Lanka, to say, hold on, you know what, let's start investigating this because this is credible allegations of evidence.
On that note, we have a short clip from the Channel 4 documentary, War Crimes Unpunished.
It was an extremely powerful program and it refers to some very worrying events, and we need to make sure we get to the bottom of what happened.
It was raised in the Australian Senate.
Serious allegations of war crimes broadcast so vividly and disturbingly on Channel 4.
It even provoked a remarkable televised statement from the former Sri Lankan President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga.
My 28-year-old son called me, sobbing on the phone, to say how ashamed he was to call himself a Sinhalese and Lankan after seeing the killing fields of Sri Lanka.
Okay, so that clip showed world leaders such as David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, as well as a minister from the Australian Senate, comment on the power and influence this documentary has had on the decision-making and policy-making of leading Western nations. In response to this, governments such as Sri Lanka and other governments in question on human rights abuses have retorted saying, well, these are affairs within our own country. Certainly America doesn't tell us how to deliver education. So their argument is that, well, we have sovereignty, we have control over our affairs. So how does the responsibility to protect doctrine and the thinking behind that explain, or what's the merit behind playing a role in a sovereign nation's affairs?
See, sovereignty is a simple notion, the notion that a country should be able to exercise its laws in its own territories. Now, on its face, it seems like a simple notion that, you know what, in international law, it's not a linear model. It's not within a country, you have the government, you have it creating its laws and it's using its enforcement mechanisms to enforce laws on its citizens. But the international law is created on the ability of parallel agreements. So it's almost treaty-based. So it's contracts that we have with each other, because no country should put its mandate on another country unless it chooses to accept that mandate.
Okay.
Now that's the notion of sovereignty, and it should be simple, but students and scholars of international law know that sovereignty is one of the most contested and litigious matters in international law, because no longer can a state say it's our own problem when it has broken laws that are accepted as international norms. International norms, and one of the norms that are emerging and have emerged, and primarily through the responsibility to protect doctrine, is that the response, it's not a right of a nation to have sovereignty, it's a responsibility on that nation. So that responsibility states that it should, as a sovereign nation, protect its own citizens from mass human rights violations. Okay. And when a nation fails or refuses to do that, then it falls on the collective international community to aid or, as a last resort, intervene to protect those citizens.
Okay, on that note, let's take a look at another clip from the Channel 4 documentary that outlines these wartime abuses. And we'll play clip 3.
Begins on the 23rd of January 2009. We have obtained this confidential internal UN analysis of satellite imagery backed by maps from the UN experts panel, which indicate they did use such weapons and they did target them on the no-fire zones.
A time series analysis of multiple artillery batteries clearly indicated that the Sri Lankan army repeatedly rotated the fire bearing of heavy caliber howitzers towards no-fire zone 2 and later no-fire zone 3. The Sri Lankan army erected mortar batteries without viable military targets, except for locations clearly falling within no-fire zone 2 and later no-fire zone 3.
On the 8th of May, in the final fortnight of the war, the no-fire zone was reduced to a tiny area just 1 mile across. This was the third no-fire zone of the war and the last. The newly leaked US cables record that the Americans tried again to suggest a ceasefire on the 17th of May.
Situation Report 74. Ambassador spoke to Gotabaya Rajapaksa, asking him to allow the International Committee of the Red Cross into the conflict zone to mediate a surrender. Rajapaksa commented, "We are beyond that now."
At the same time, the hospitals, which had again been shelled, were overwhelmed with the dead and the dying. But no outside help was to arrive. As the US cables reveal, the President's office continued to refuse access to the Red Cross.
Situation Report 74. Ambassador again requested access for the International Committee of the Red Cross to the area to evacuate the wounded.
The request was
energetically refused.
So the clip was a very powerful and moving one, and with it comes a discussion on the power and influence the media has on these international this international action. What have you found? To what extent have you found this video to be, and the previous documentary by Channel 4 to have played a role in these international discussions?
I think the media is a definite need and an important player, especially when it comes to internal armed conflicts. So conflicts that occur within one border, and on one side of the conflict is a state or state-sponsored actors. So when you have that kind of imbalance of power between two conflicting parties, there's a tendency towards that powerful party to control what the storyline is and how that storyline gets out, and to restrict media from playing a role within that conflict. Now, this is Sri Lanka is not the first conflict that this has occurred. A recent and similar conflict in Darfur, similar actions happened. Darfur did restrict media, did restrict UN bodies, but not to the extent that Sri Lanka did. There were still UN bodies allowed to function in the war zones. There was the the African Union that functioned within the conflict zone. So there was still some information that leaked out. And therefore, through that information, the international players were able to objectively come to a conclusion of whether these crimes did amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. Now, in Sri Lanka, we don't have that option. We don't get to assess what the true events did occur. So you have different parties, whether that be the government or whether that be other parties fighting on the other side, alleging certain incidents or their own storyline behind the incident. So media plays a good role in bringing out information on the other side opposing the government to be able to sort of, for an independent, objective observer to understand what the evidence is. But mind you, you have to take everyone's information, even an independent media, their evidence with a grain of salt, because I think at the end of the day, it's all information that an objective person can object.
Are there any examples on countries that have accepted this idea of the international community playing a role in their own affairs that allowed for conflict resolution, that have opened the doors for the international community?
You know what? There is a universal consensus on the principles behind the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is the idea that a nation should protect its own citizens, and if it fails to, other countries should aid or, at last resort, intervene in protecting those citizens. Now, that speaks to the ability to protect its citizens during grave human rights abuses. Now, in 2005, in a General Assembly, UN General Assembly, there was a unanimous acceptance to that rule. So even though that is not codified in law, it's an accepted norm, which can be enforced legally. However, post human rights abuses, so if the human rights abuses has occurred and there was no intervention or aid from the international community, what do we do now? How does the international community play a role in bringing accountability to the table? Now, that is actually a very novel area of international law. It's being brought up now, and Sri Lanka is one of the test case studies for that concept, which is coming up forth. So there's no set hard and fast rule. However, what I think everybody is looking towards is an independent investigation of these war crimes when there's serious allegations of serious violations of crime. Now, independent does not necessarily mean international. Independent can be a domestic and should be a domestic mechanism if it can be perceived to be non-biased. Now, when you have a state that's being alleged of these crimes and the state has a role in appointing a body, the independency is obviously lost and the appearance of independency is lost.
So how could a domestic body be set up without the influence or the role of the state?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer, but what can happen is if the state genuinely chooses to say, listen, okay, there has been allegations, we contest that there is no human rights violations, but to set up this independent investigation, we will set up this body consisting of non-state actors, so people who are not directly being able to be influenced by the government, so maybe foreign Sri Lankan diaspora academics, as well as to really add credibility, foreign bodies like the eminent
but ultimately appointed by the government.
Appointed by you cannot have a real true investigation without the sanction of the government, because if the government does not agree to accept this independent investigation, it's going to be hard for practical real life investigative mechanisms to take place in the country.
Thank you, Cubase. It's time for a quick break, and we'll please rejoin us shortly. Welcome back. Today we're here with Cubase Navaratnam discussing Channel 4's recently released documentary, Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, War Crimes Unpunished. Cubase, as we were speaking just before the break, and the idea of the international community's role in finding some level of accountability in Sri Lanka. On a more practical level, how can members of the diaspora, how can other international community actors play a role, whether it's using this film or not, or in general, to help serve the people of Sri Lanka?
So in this conflict, most of the narrative has been through Sri Lankan government's narrative. So the story has been told by one party. The Tamil diaspora has, from the onset of the final phases of war, has tried to tell the world of another storyline. Now the key is the Sri Lankan government has at its disposal many resources to help avail to its side of its storyline. Channel 4 is one tool that can be used to help shed another side of that story. But as a diaspora, we have to take everything with a grain of salt. And I think as an international body, we have to understand that there has to be, in order to get a level of objective evidence out in the public, so that the international body can have more resources at its disposal, we have to now take evidence like the Channel 4 documentary and other documented evidence to the international body. And I think why the timing of the Channel 4 documentary, this recent one, is to do such, which is to bring, it was brought out at the timing of the 19th session of the UN Human Rights Council, and I know Gary was coming on the show to speak about that, but I think bringing evidence like this and documented and tested evidence into the public light and putting pressure on the decision makers, the politicians, to act, to put pressure Sri Lanka to act. Because at the end of the day, the most impact and the biggest change that can happen is with the government of Sri Lanka. It might not be the current government of Sri Lanka, and in international law, it is not a short game. So it might not be the current government that acts on the truth, but the key is to get that truth out there. Truth telling is the most important element of reconciliation and eventually peace. So whether we act on it, whether it's feasible to get any criminals or alleged criminals in front of a tribunal, that's another matter, and that's maybe the step 2. But step 1 is to ensure truth is brought out and brought out to the public. So what the Channel 4 documentary is one way of doing that, and hopefully the other truth documents come out in the public.
On a final note, of course, no two countries are similar, and no two conflicts, no two wars are the same. But are there any examples that can provide perhaps hope to some sort of level of truth and reconciliation that Sri Lanka can aspire to?
That's a difficult question because, as you said, many conflicts are different. And if you look back in the recent internal armed conflicts within a state, usually justice or truth has come out when the victims have persevered, have won. So in the Rwandan genocide, it's because the Tutsis came into power, were the Hutus and the criminals were they able to be put in front of a tribunal. And in the former Yugoslavia, the same thing happened. So what has to happen is the ruling party, or the majority of the people, have to support accountability. Now in Sri Lanka, that's not the case right now. There's a silent majority, I believe, that if the truth comes out, they will also support some accountability. But right now, their only storyline is the government storyline. So if we can bring to the public, if the people on the ground, Sri Lankan citizens, evidence of this truth, I think that would be a first move in bringing out hope that we can get accountability just like other countries have.
All right. Thank you, Cubase. That's all the time we have for this part of the show. But we'd love to have you back at another point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we bring in our next guest, there's a final clip we'd like to play from the recently released documentary.
Sir John Holmes, here meeting President Rajapaksa in Colombo, was the head of the UN's humanitarian operations at the time.
The accusation against the UN and against the international community is that basically the Rajapaksa regime ran rings round you. It gave you assurances that weren't true, it told you barefaced lies, and continued on doing what it was doing.
Well, I think that's largely true, that they did make promises which they didn't keep, and they did do what they intended to do all the way through, which is to finish the LTT off militarily, no matter what it cost, including in civilian lives. They didn't believe that anybody in the international community was prepared to stop them, and they were right.
Even where there was sympathy for the beleaguered Tamil civilians, in a world still dominated by the rhetoric of the war on terror, there was apparently no will to do anything for them.
A lot of governments, including the Indian government, because of their own huge Tamil population, wanted to show concern. At the same time, there was a sort of implicit green light for the government to finish off the LTT.
There were a lot of people, a lot of countries around the world who were actually probably happy to close their eyes and just have the LTTE dealt with.
There was a bit of a diplomatic dance around all this, with everybody knowing that the end of this was going to be an inevitable military victory of the government and the inevitable defeat of the LTTE, and it was a question of waiting for that to happen, hoping it happened as quickly as possible, and that it happened with as few civilian casualties as possible. So that may sound a bit cynical, but that's the reality of what I was observing.
Having won its war, the Sri Lankan government warned the rest of the world to stay out of Sri Lanka's affairs. In a keynote speech to the United Nations in New York, President Mahinda Rajapaksa insisted he would deal with things in his own way.
If history has taught us one thing, it is that impose external solutions breed resentment and ultimately fail. Ours, by contrast, is a homegrown process.
Rajapaksa, however, was quite happy to seek an external helping hand when it came to ramming home his message, as this secretly recorded conversation with an executive of the British public relations company Bell Pottinger reveals.
We had a team working in the President's office, and we wrote...
Welcome back. Our next guest is Gary Anandasungari. He's a lawyer and community activist. He represents Lawyers' Rights Watch at the United Nations Human Rights Council. He is also the legal counsel to the Canadian Tamil Congress. Welcome, Gary. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. So, as I understand, you were recently in Geneva at the current Human Rights Council, and you were there as a member of the Lawyers' Rights Watch, and which was involved in the resolution put forth by the United States. For our viewers, can you please explain the nature of the resolution, its implications, and the dynamics surrounding it? Yeah.
It's quite a complex scenario. First of all, in 2009, right after the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, there was an attempt to have a similar resolution, a resolution that would bring all parties to the conflict to account for allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Because even then, issues had surfaced that there were gross violations of international law. And as a body that's charged with implementing and upholding international law, the Human Rights Council actually failed in 2009 to come up with any substantive resolution. In fact, the resolution put forth was a self-congratulatory one that basically congratulated the government of Sri Lanka for defeating terrorism and gave a blank check effectively for any follow-up. Yeah. So this particular resolution that's before the 19th session of the Human Rights Council has been in the works for close to 3 years, and we've had a number of different iterations of this over the past several weeks. And what's now on the table that will likely be voted this week, subject to any other amendments that come in, is a threefold resolution. The first one being calling for the implementation of the constructive components of the LLRC, and this is where there may be some confusion, because LLRC itself is a very flawed document.
For our viewers, can you quickly tell us what the LLRC stands for? And
sure.
what it is?
It's a Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission that was put together by the Sri Lankan government as a response to some of the criticisms from the international community. It never was an accountability mechanism. It was never there to ensure accountability of the parties who violated human rights law. It was never there as a real reconciliation process. So it's not like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa right after the end of apartheid, which basically said, had people who were perpetrators as well as victims sitting together and saying, I did wrong, I'm sorry for what I did. Some form of, justice that would allow people to move on with their lives. This particular LLRC report was never meant to be such a mechanism. It was, in fact, by all accounts, an eyewash to ensure that the international community stayed away from Sri Lanka. But notwithstanding that, there are some important provisions there, I think, that can be implemented and that can have some utility. They are very limited in scope, but nevertheless, it is the starting point of this resolution, because one of the things that the international community wants is an internal process to work. But it doesn't stop there. It asks for
So the first part is the implication of the constructive elements of the LLRC. And the second?
And the second part is to for the Sri Lankan government to basically take legal responsibility and to ensure that there is an independent process, not necessarily international, but an independent process that would ensure that there's justice, there's accountability, and so on. So there's a second component to it that's quite critical.
Could elements sorry to interrupt, but could elements of that independent inquiry involve members from the international community, but it would ultimately be appointed by the government of Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. It would have to be, it'll be somewhat controlled by the government of Sri Lanka, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Like Sri Lanka could elect to say, let's have the panel of experts report implemented, right? I mean, it's completely within the purview of the government of Sri Lanka. But what's important is this resolution is a first step. So one of the things that I don't want to leave an impression is that it is the conclusive, element of a very long and hard fought conflict. It's not. It is actually a starting point for any longer term possibilities, and that's one of the things that we want to get across, is that Sri Lanka has gotten away with murder by all accounts, and this is really the first avenue by which international community is centering Sri Lanka into some form of process that whereby they are accountable to the international community, and this is really the first step. So the second component of the resolution is an implementation process. So Sri Lanka has to come back to Council as soon as possible with a process of implementing these recommendations. And thirdly is very important, which is both the timeline as well as involvement of the High Commissioner's office in terms of implementing.
Which High Commissioner? The High Commissioner for Human Rights?
For Human Rights, which is Navi Pillai, her office, in facilitating any implementation of this resolution. And it requires the High Commissioner to come back to Council in next March, which is a year from now, to really come back with some concrete recommendations as to what has happened, sort of report on what's happened, and also provide mechanisms how this can go forward.
So the third aspect of this resolution is the timeline.
Absolutely.
A part of it. And does this timeline specify a time period? Is it
next March is really the timeline. It's a 1-year timeline for the High Commissioner to get her hands dirty on this and come back and make some recommendations, right? So if Sri Lankan government doesn't move in any substantive way, then it really comes back into the international community. It comes back into the Human Rights Council, and at that point, further actions could be warranted.
And the government of Sri Lanka's response to it is obviously negative. They don't appreciate it, they don't support it. Is it a total lack of support, or is it parts of it that the government has?
Well, Sri Lanka and many countries in the what's called the non-aligned movement, some of the sort of the southern, quote-unquote southern, eastern countries, eastern blocs, don't want to have anything to do with the international community. So as in, there is no international law that should be applied unless the country itself applies it, which is ridiculous, because the reason for international law is that we have a general set of standards by which all countries, all peoples abide by. So certain rights are absolutely fundamental. They're across the board to everyone, and it should apply to everyone. And as is international law, it should be applicable to all countries. It's actually ridiculous to think that certain countries can violate international law and not be accountable. So as a whole, we have an opposition to this resolution that's coming primarily from Sri Lanka, but it's supported by countries like Cuba, Russia, China, and you kind of named the countries that have fairly dismal human rights records, and they are currently opposing the resolution with all its ability. And the challenge that we have is to work with countries sort of who are in the middle ground. So some of the African countries, some of what's called the Gulag countries, the South American countries, who kind of see the need to have international human rights standards, but who are maybe torn by this rhetoric of imperialism.
Yeah, and their own connections with these similar southern and eastern countries. Thank you, Gary, for providing that great overview of the resolution. When we return from break, we'll take a look at the dynamics at Geneva that are taking place, some of the challenges and hurdles facing the resolution, and some of Gary's own experience at Geneva. We'll be back shortly. Today we're here with Gary Anandasangari, a lawyer who represented Lawyers' Right Watch at the current United Nations Human Rights Council. So Gary's telling us about the nature of the resolution that's been put forth by the United States of America and some of his own experience and the dynamics behind it. Gary, one of the concerns from members of our Tamil community in the diaspora is that the resolution put forth is considered weak or a bit of a compromise. How do you feel about that, given the nature of what's happening?
Sure, I would actually absolutely agree. It is a very weak resolution, and it is a compromise resolution, right? So, we need to look at it in the context of international law and where the Tamil community actually stands within the Human Rights Council. Effectively, for the last, I think that this is the first real resolution that's coming forward that is at least somewhat favorable to the Tamil community in 24 years, which is a very significant move because we haven't advocated this at the international level to the extent where there is actual movement. So for the first time, we do see something positive. But having said that, there are some serious limitations that we've actually highlighted, and one of the major ones being that it doesn't refer to the panel of experts reports. So the UN panel of experts reports as appointed by Ban Ki-moon.
And this is what's referred to as the Darusman report?
The Darusman report is one way to say it. And that particular report has some very significant language there and content that I think can be very helpful to the situation. But there's no mention of it because for political reasons it's seen as something that is that may be seen as too extreme, and we may not have sufficient votes to get something on paper. If you look at sort of the build-up to this particular resolution, back in January, the conversation that most of us in the NGO community were having is that, oh my God, there's no resolution, there's nothing. After all of this, we're ending up with zero. Last September,
and especially given the 2009 resolution, which congratulated Sri Lanka.
Exactly, but then you also have to look at the last sort of attempt at having a resolution, which was last September, a proposal by Canada, which basically, one-liner that said, have Sri Lanka come and present the LLRC report at the Human Rights Council in March, right? So we see that progression, and relative to that, what we find this resolution to be a very nuanced compromise of various different factors. It doesn't intrude too much into Sri Lankan, within the Sri Lankan polity, it doesn't, but it does give opportunities for the council to actually follow up. So if you see the pressures with Syria, with a lot of the other countries where there's ongoing current gross human rights violations, it's very easy for the international community to ignore the issues in Sri Lanka after being at such a height for the last 3 to 4 years. It's very easy for the international community to just walk away. And what we thought was this resolution allows and actually forces the hand of the international community to re-deal with this issue in a year. And it gives that 1-year opportunity for any substantive progress to be made by both the Human Rights Commissioner as well as the government of Sri Lanka. If they really want to exert goodwill, this is the time to do it. If they don't, then there is a stick that's attached to this resolution wherein they need to come back in a year and further actions can be taken. So this is really a starting point, as I said. It cannot be seen as a conclusive element. It is an absolute first step in a much longer, protracted engagement that we need to have with the Human Rights Council.
What have you, from your experience presenting at the UN and your general observations of the various actors that have made their presence at the Human Rights Council. What kind of dynamics have you observed? Have you noticed?
Well, there's really three basic dynamics. One is the NGO community, and I can tell you the NGO sector. And if you look at, you can go through the organizations: Amnesty, HRW, International Crisis Group, International Commission of Jurists, a group of eminent persons. You can look at half a dozen international NGOs who've done a phenomenal job in keeping this alive. And then you have regional players like the Asian Human Rights Commission, Forum Asia. They've continued this, and they've actually made this is their resolution. I mean, they've worked extremely hard to bring it up to this point. And they're really the forces behind it, right? Then you have obviously the Western interest, and by that I mean the European Union, Canada, the US, and Australia, who have, for whatever reason, really taken this issue on in the last 2 years. Obviously the EU was instrumental initially, 2009, but they were despondent after the whole collapse of the resolution. They backed away, and now they seem to be re-engaged, and there is this dynamic.
And who led this resolution?
Well, this particular resolution is really a US-led initiative, right? And our preference is that that there be wider support from sort of the African and Gulag countries. But the reality is, I think US is a very powerful player, and whatever interests may lie underneath their intent to do this, it's nevertheless a very important first step. So we welcome their initiative, but we are still encouraging other countries to sign on as co-sponsors, right? And that could be very important to us, because oftentimes this whole discussion is really seen as a divide between the North and the South, and it's not. It's really about whether you support international human rights or you don't support international human rights.
In this discussion of international players and actors, India looms very large. Can you discuss the role India is playing, not only just in Sri Lanka in general, but also with regard to this resolution?
Well, India is the elephant in the room, right? And people don't want to talk about it, but the reality is India has a very significant role to play. We are still unable to gauge their stand on this, and then there's, based on domestic issues in Tamil Nadu, you see some movement towards support, but you also see other initiatives where they may not be supporting it. So it's very hard to predict where India is going to stand, but India's position is going to be critical at the day of the vote. And we're hoping, and we're sincerely trying to get their support, because I think India, in the region, India is a major player, and India, given what's happened, India does have a responsibility as well to ensure that there is longer-term accountability and peace in the region. And I think it's incumbent upon India to take a very serious, long and hard look at its position over the years, and to somehow, set the right direction so that there is positive movement in the future.
In opposition almost, or in tandem with the discussion on India, is the discussion on China. Can you comment on China's, were they active at Geneva?
Obviously China has been a very important ally to Sri Lanka. So every side event that's taken place where they've had an opportunity to speak, they've come out in favor of Sri Lanka. They've supported Sri Lanka's move towards reconciliation. They've supported Sri Lanka's initiatives, towards transparency and so on and so forth. Look, at the end of the day, I personally don't look at a country like China as a standard bearer of human rights, right? And if this is the type of friends that Sri Lanka wants to associate with, the saying goes, you are who your friends are. And if this is the approach that Sri Lanka wants to take, then that's not a constructive path towards proper peace and justice in Sri Lanka, right? So, but we have seen unfortunately that Sri Lanka continues to engage with countries like China, countries like Iran, countries who do not have adequate human rights standards, and they're the people that are advocating for Sri Lanka's rights to sovereignty. So it has really become a paradox between these states and these type of positions in international the international fora, and we're hoping that the resolution will pass, notwithstanding these polarized views, because human rights as a international norm and basic standards need to prevail over regional and individual country interests.
Right. So if this resolution passes, and if not, what do we stand to see if it fails, or if
there's two things. I think in terms of the Tamil community, whether it passes or it doesn't pass, you know, our program on Friday or Saturday or the day after is the same, right? We need to pick up and we need to continue, right? Even if it passes, there's a lot more work to do, and the Tamil community as an international needs to continue to engage in this process and continue to participate in a constructive way. So I don't think our work plan changes in any significant way.
If it passes, are there any legalistic things placed on Sri Lanka to promote this action, or is it still self-directed?
It is, to some extent, it's self-directed. So the pressure points, you know, we need to continue to, you know, hit those right pressure points so that there is movement on this in Sri Lanka. But also we need to engage the Office of the High Commissioner to outline some of our overall concerns, and through them make sure that there's increased level of accountability, right? So, you know, notwithstanding the passage or failure of this resolution, our work plan will continue. In terms of the international community, I think each of the countries, we would need to revisit them and re-engage with them. So the countries that didn't support us, I think we need to have an increased level of presence there, and to be able to engage them in a way that will make them understand. I mean, for example, Cuba is a perfect example, right? Cuba is a country whose historical you know, existence is based on a concept of freedom. Right, and if you look at what Fidel Castro has done, you know, he's admired by many in our community for leading, you know, leading this revolution against capitalism. Right, so he's not someone that the Tamils should necessarily look at as a natural enemy. Cuba, you know, fundamentally, there's things that would or should lead Cuba to support the struggle of the Tamil people.
One final question before we wrap up: how has Canada's role been in the United Nations?
Well, Canada's, you know, played a very significant role and a facilitative role in this particular session. Canada has led the charge, you know, in September, and I think this particular government's been very engaged with respect to Sri Lanka, and we're very pleased at their nuanced approach to the whole situation, and we're quite...
Have they engaged with any of those countries that are on the fence or voting against it?
Well, I mean, certainly the US and Canada and many of the Western countries
strategy.
As a broader strategy have engaged and have been very instrumental in pushing some of the African countries and so on. But, you know, it's a collective effort. It's not a one-person operation. So Canada's played a very crucial role within that team.
Thank you for coming on, Gary. We
Thank you,
appreciate
Prati.
your time and experience. That's all the time we have for today's show, viewers, and we hope you tune in next Sunday when your host will be Manjula Selvaraja. Thank you.